annual summit here in Davos. And one of the more dominant conversations, not just here in Davos, but across the world, has been about the future of work across industries, across professions, and across countries. Well, I have with me an expert to talk about what the future of work will look like in the years to come. Jonas Prising, the chairman and CEO of Manpower Group. John, thank you so much for your time here in Davos.
Thank
I
you.
know it's been an incredibly busy week as many global business leaders turn to you to understand how to deal with the talent shortages that we're witnessing across the world, some of the other challenges pertaining to skilling, equality in the workforce, unionization, and flexibility. And these are all issues I want to bring up to you. But first, the talent shortage. I understand that in a recent survey that the Manpower Group did, that there is a severe talent shortage across the world, and that amongst the top countries witnessing that, India is one of them as well.
Indeed.
I'd like for you to give us a broad overview of where and how you see this unfolding.
Well, it's been very interesting to see how the labor markets have recovered after the pandemic, or still during the pandemic, because it's still ongoing. And by and large, the health of labor markets is back to where it was at pre-pandemic levels. But due to the pandemic, parts of the workforce are not back yet and fully participating. So the supply of workforce is constrained in many markets. And the survey that we did as Manpower Group really illustrates that point, because most labor markets globally have very high shortages of talent. So some of that, I think, we can attribute to the effect of the pandemic, and some of it we can attribute to the long-term structural trends, which is related to the demographic evolution, the birth rates, and new workers coming into the workforce, which has been declining over the last decades and is continuing to decline going forward as well. So it's a mix between a pandemic related impact as well as a structural trend that is continuing and will continue into the future as well.
Are we witnessing these talent shortages in specific industries and specific skill sets, or would you say that they're fairly broad?
I would say that they're fairly broad, but at this stage of the pandemic, in many countries, the highest level of talent shortages are in the industries that were impacted the hardest during the pandemic. Leisure, so all of the things that we couldn't do as consumers, where people eventually had to leave their workplaces because those businesses weren't operating due to lockdowns, that's where you're seeing the toughest time attracting talent back, because they've either moved on to different industries, or they're still not certain that this recovery is truly lasting. So they're still waiting to get back into their former employment and their former industry. But we think that over time, this anomaly generated by the pandemic will subside and things will start to normalize, but normalize towards still a very tight labor market in almost all countries across the world.
If they're moving to newer industries, does that mean the demand for job in newer industries is increased by as much, which is attracting talent from conventional industries, some of the services industries that were the worst hit in the pandemic? Can you explain what this balance is or how it's working out to be?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between, the structure evolution, which is, moving away from manufacturing and into a services-based economy in many countries, and distinguish that from the events that happened during the pandemic, which were extreme and unusual. So it also has a lot to do with how countries reacted during the lockdown phases. In Europe, employment relationships were maintained and governments paid companies to maintain the employment. In the US, governments sent money to the individual, and that meant the employment relationship was ruptured, which means a lot of people changed industries. So they then gravitated towards industries that they felt were less cyclical and or less impacted by the pandemic. But by and large, we don't think that this indicates a trend of shift between industries. We still think that this is dealing with pent-up demand for products and services, and that's what's attracting this upsurge in demand. Over time, we would expect that to subside and normalize to a general level of demand that is commensurate with the economic growth that any particular country is experiencing.
You also attributed this to some long term structural changes in demography, for instance. Uh, do you believe because of that, some of these shortages will become endemic to certain industries, and those industries will struggle to find the kind of talent that they need, especially, let's say, maybe in the lower income worker groups or the blue collar worker groups? Or do you think maybe the shortages will become endemic in any other group?
I think that during the pandemic, we got a glimpse into the future
Hmm.
of work as it relates to the acceleration of these structural trends. What's it like when demographic means there's less workers available in a market? What's it like when technology is accelerating rapidly and we have to work and collaborate in very different ways that we were used to? What's it like when individuals make choices not only based on compensation, but on their aspirations, looking for companies that represent their values, other benefits, and finally, looking at how companies react to this environment and how they think about their supply chain in different ways. So it gave us an opportunity to look into the future. I think that once we get over this pandemic caused disruption, you will have some aspects of structural trends that are the same as they were before, but
Hmm.
you will also have some new ones. And above all, we believe that the lasting legacy of the pandemic is going to be an increased expectation for the individual for more flexibility.
Okay. Besides that, are there any other kinds of challenges you see these trends throw up? I do know in some of the conversations you've been having, not here in just in Davos, but otherwise as well, you expect reskilling to be a big challenge that employers face across the world to be able to adapt or mitigate some of these trends.
No, I think that's a very good point because the workforce is generally bifurcated between haves and have nots in terms of skill sets. Those with the right skills have plenty of opportunities. Those that don't have the skills that employers are looking for, they will be subject to changes. And we think that the defining challenge of our time will be to bridge the gap between the haves and the have nots in terms of skill and engage in massive reskilling and upskilling initiatives at a country level. Most employers are actively engaged today more than ever before at reskilling and upskilling their employees. Many employers in India have this as one of the hallmarks of their employment and how they attract new employees. Many companies across the world use exactly the same way to build, the skills for the people that work for them. But I think we will need to think about a massive investment in reskilling and upskilling so that we can bridge this gap that otherwise could threaten us with polarization of the workforce, which ultimately ends up being a polarized society.
Absolutely. One of the other challenges is bringing women back to work. You mentioned flexibility. That might be a key attraction. But otherwise, do you think companies and employers are doing enough? I know you've mentioned the underrepresentation of women in the workforce several times before. I'd like for you to talk us through the post pandemic scenario and what employers are doing to be able to bring women back to work because women deserve to come back to work, but also because it will help mitigate some of these talent shortages.
Well, just as you described, during the pandemic, women were disproportionately hit and affected by the pandemic as the various industries where they overrepresented were hit hardest,
Hmm.
and they shouldered burden in terms of elder care and child care in many parts of the world. So we believe that flexibility will provide an opportunity for women to combine work life and personal lives better, and employers are working very hard at attracting women back and increasing the amount of women they can attract into their organization because the talent shortage is so high and women generally are more educated than men. So it is a imperative for many organizations to want women to come back. And at this point, what we're seeing employers doing is being much more flexible, much more purposeful in the choices of benefits that they offer women, and the flexibility that they can offer women, so that they can combine their home life as well as their professional life. But ultimately, it's going to come down to the choices that women want, and I think this is going to be a positive aspect of the pandemic because women will be able to express, what they need to be successful in a professional life with more options than before the pandemic.
Okay. The third trend I wanted to get your thoughts on was unionization, especially in the Western world. We're seeing it play out in different ways at Amazon, at Starbucks. Um, how do you view this return to collective bargaining power? What do you think is prompting it? In some countries like India, it's workers in the gig economies that are coming together to find ways to express their need for better working conditions and their rights. What do you make of these trends across the world?
Well, I think it's essentials workers realizing that they're essential and knowing that they have the upper hand since employers are looking for their talent. And they are now voicing their opinions, their needs as a condition for coming back and staying with any particular company. So I think that is the change that you're seeing. It's a reflection of a very tight labor market. It's a reflection of the self-realization from employees' perspective that they're very important for the success of this organization and that they don't feel that they have been adequately recognized for that importance. It's also important to put it into context of the evolution of unionization over the arc of time. Unionization has been on a rapid decline for decades. So we are now seeing certain industries where workers are trying to group together to better be able to express their needs and what they would like to see happen in terms of compensation and benefits. But frankly, I would say it's a little bit too early to talk about a reversal of trend because I think it is a moment in time where we are coming out of the pandemic in very tight labor markets where essential workers and frontline workers feel that they've been very negatively affected by the pandemic and they really want to see their working conditions improve. And I would guess and believe that employers are going to be very responsive to their expectations because they need this talent inside their organizations.
Are they going to be responsive? Because I can see companies across the world push back on this trend, especially in the gig economy, because that's how their businesses are structured to treat workers as contractors and outsourcers and not as employees. So I'm just wondering where we'll see this trend move or what the outcomes of this will be, because the gig economy is not designed to be an employer-employee relationship as we conventionally know it.
But we think that is a trend that will evolve as well.
Okay.
Because the gig economy today is really trading on the margin. It is really trying to get hold of excess capacity and provide that excess capacity for different products and services.
Right. Yes.
There is no excess capacity today. So therefore, workers are saying, hang on, I have choices. I can do other things. So unless I get this here and unless we can establish a good relationship, I'm going to take my talent and do this work or do another kind of work somewhere else in an industry that I prefer. So I think that's the difference that you're seeing. And based on the trend and the evolution, we think gig work, for instance, will be a great supplementary occupation. But if you are full-time engaged in gig work, we have no doubt that the clarity around an employee-employer relationship will over time have to be established to attract the talent that industry needs.
No, that's very well put. You spoke of flexibility. I want to go back to that point. The manifestation of that is the 4-day work week. Some countries have already adopted it. For instance, Iceland. I'm wondering, is it going to really become widespread across industries, across countries? How do you see this unfold?
Well, I think it's interesting to look at this also from a historical perspective. At the beginning of the 1900s, 1910, our work week was 70, 80 hours a week. This was normal. This was the way the world was. Eventually, we introduced half a Sunday that was off. And then eventually we migrated to a 5-day, 40-hour work week in some countries. In other countries, lower. Some other countries, higher. So we think the 4-day work week is just another manifestation of employees' desire for more flexibility. Whether it works, I think, is going to be very dependent on the organization and the preferences of those employees. So I don't think we are looking at a pendulum shift to the degree that we saw with a 5-day work week and 40 hours, because there's so many other options. You can work 5 days, but really you have flexibility in the hours that you work. You could work 7 days and work less every day. We have many industries where this has been the established norm. If you're a nurse, you have long work days, but fewer of them. If
Yeah.
you're a pilot, you're going to be flying for 3 days and be off for 4 days. So this is already an established practice in many industries. So I think there is some discussion that sounds a little bit hyperbolic at this point
Mhm.
because it's just another part of the desire for more flexibility.
A quick question on India. I'm asking for an overview, not a very deep down question, but I do know that in your Manpower survey, you did say that India was one of the top 5 countries reporting the strongest net employment outlook. That is, India wants to hire more. How do you see some of these trends and issues that we've discussed impacting India given that demand scenario?
Well, I think that India is in a formidable position in many industries because India has a skilled and educated talent pool that the world wants. And you have many successful Indian companies that have the globe, the world as their market. And Indian companies are very well placed, and as you will have seen here in Davos as well, extremely well represented
Yes.
amongst the participants, which is just an indication of how important and successful Indian companies have been in providing their products and services to companies across the world. And a big reason for that is that India has access to a skilled talent pool. And in this war for talent, the country that has the talent pool wins. And you can see it on a country basis, and you can also see it on a company basis. And it's very encouraging to see that the outlook of Indian employers is positive as we look into the third quarter.
John, is the great resignation over? Because we still read about very high attrition rates. You're talking about India. I can tell you some of India's top IT companies that provide IT services to global clients are seeing some of their highest attrition rates ever.
Yes.
I think at TCS, almost 1/3 of the workforce is turning over in a year. That's an incredible challenge. So, is the great resignation, whether in the US or in India, over or not? I ask as a team leader.
Well, I think it's important to note that the Great Resignation, which we think more of as a great reshuffle,
Uh-huh.
is a function of extremely tight labor markets, and it's entirely consistent with what you would see in a normal economic cycle, except that this economic cycle is boosted by a pandemic, where demand for products and services is very high, and then demand for workforce is extremely high, with full transparency for the workforce in terms of the opportunities and compensation levels that they have between various organizations. So we would expect turnover of staff to go up significantly in this kind of environment.
Yes.
It's not a lifestyle choice that most people make. The vast majority of people who resign from one organization move straight away into another organization. This is all to do with opportunity to gain a better living with an organization that individuals feel will be a better fit. So as the economy starts to slow down in terms of growth rate and the labor market demand normalizes following the pandemic, we would expect that the turnover of staff is coming down as well.
And concurrently, wage inflation will then continue as an outcome of the generalized inflation we're seeing across economies, but also as an outcome of the shortage in the labor markets.
We've seen a tremendous spike in the
Yes.
wage inflation, and frankly, it's bifurcated as well. So right now, it is more on the essential worker side than it is on the knowledge worker side, although the knowledge worker side also has more than average wage inflation. But over time, we expect this to moderate as well. We think that in the US, we've seen the peak of wage inflation, and we will expect that to gradually come down. The same is true for Europe and also for many other parts of the world. So it will take longer than we would have previously expected, but we think wage inflation is going to moderate and come down over time. So we should see some change towards the end of the year.
If you'd like to leave us with a thought on the future of work, we've discussed many issues, so I'll leave it up to you to wrap this up and summarize what you think the future of work will be over the next year or two, at least.
I think we've really seen interesting evolutions and quite positive evolutions. We've rebalanced a little bit of the power between employers and employees, boosted by this pandemic, this unfortunate pandemic. And if you go back historically and look at what's happened with other major disruptive events, many times for workers, it has actually worked out to improve their working conditions, their pay rates. And I would estimate that also in the aftermath of the pandemic, that we will feel that the labor markets are stronger and better for more people than they were before the pandemic.
That's an encouraging thought. Thank you so much for an insightful conversation here in Davos. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.